Am I on? There we go. Good morning, everybody. All right, I can see you're tempted, so I'm going to give you a quick 10 seconds to stand up, stretch your legs. Those who need it, please feel free to enjoy a moment. Don't be shy, ladies. Oh, and gentlemen. So please just stand up and catch your breath and stretch arms and legs, and let's get the blood flowing. Yes, there we go. Thank you. Yes, feel free. Stretch to the left. Stretch. I feel like yoga, but you can't do that in these shoes, so. All right, if I can ask you to just take your seats once again. A very, very good morning to each and every one of you, ladies as well as gentlemen. My name is Dumi Makhabo. I am a broadcaster and entrepreneur based in South Africa, well, Johannesburg specifically, but in South Africa. And one of my great passions, not just because I happen to live there or was born there, is the African continent. And needless to say, right now, the continent seems to be on every single person's lips. And we all understand why. But the big question is that Africa isn't existing or living in isolation. There are other partners, there are other players that influence what happens on the continent. So, you know, when one person sneezes, the other catches a flu. I'm not naming anybody, so don't feel upset because I didn't say Europe sneezed and we caught a cold. I didn't say that. I'm just saying that when one person sneezes, the other one catches a cold. So the big question for us in this session is to ask the question around whether indeed we need to look at what we're doing, the models that we're pursuing and following, and whether indeed those models need to change. And if they do need to change, how? And of course the big question, who's going to drive that change? Before we begin that discussion, a reminder though that your mobile phone or your iPad or whichever gadget you have is actually going to be on during the session because we want your questions and your perspectives on the conversation we're having. So if you look on the screen behind me, you'll be able to see a reminder in case you didn't get the number or you didn't get the Twitter hashtag of exactly which mechanism you can use to get in touch with us. Right, you can do so. SMS, email, Twitter. Log on to instantreact.com/WF12. And for our international guests, of course, Wi-Fi Women's Forum. And you'll notice the key. So please do make a note of that. There will be a small line at the bottom of the screen just to remind you. But it's important that you just make a note so you don't have to keep going back every time you want to send us a note. Without any further ado, because I can tend to be a bit of a hog on this stage if I am given the opportunity, I'd like to rather call our guests on to the stage. Some really incredible, awesome women are going to be joining me in just a second, and then I'm going to leave them to come and join you. So let's see how this works. And you guys, as long as you cooperate and play and let me drive the bus, it's all going to be okay, trust me. Okay, the first person I'd like to call on, not only is she gorgeous, but she's certainly an inspiration in her own right. Abina Amoa is founder and CEO of Baobab Advisors and member of the Investment Advisory Committee of the Ghana Petroleum Wealth Funds. Abina, thank you very much. Please take a seat, whichever one you prefer, but maybe this one, so perfect. I know, whichever one you prefer, but maybe this one, right? Yeah, at least someone called it. Nigest Haile is founder and executive director of the Center for African Women Economic Empowerment. She's also a member of the jury for the Cartier Women's Initiative Awards. Nigest, thank you very much. And last but no certainly least, I don't think you ever need an introduction, but I have to say your name anyway. Please welcome Maria Ramos, the CEO of the ABSA Group. Ladies, you do have your microphones there, so please feel free to use them. If I may begin with you, Maria. You have the often unique position of having sat in the public sector and also now in the private sector at very high strategic levels. No doubt everybody is now talking on the continent, or many people on the continent are talking about what do we need to do differently. We're now terrified because things clearly aren't working in other parts of the world. What do we need to change? What do we need to change, if we need to change at all? Oh, It's on.
Thank you very much, Tumi, and good morning, everyone. You know, there are clearly things we obviously have to change, and I think everywhere you go and listening to the news this morning and listening to the comments made by Christine Lagarde and the new president of the World Bank, you can listen from the tone, again at the IMF World Bank meetings that are taking place and about to start in Tokyo this weekend, that the real and the challenging issues of our time are youth unemployment and the drive for a more sustainable, more inclusive growth for the globe. And these challenges are not just African challenges, they're global challenges. And of course, they're also the challenges for our continent. And Africa is a continent. It's a continent with 54 countries and very different countries across the continent. So in the way that these challenges present themselves in each one of the countries on the continent, they present themselves slightly differently. So there's a lot that we need to think about. There are changes that we need to think about. More inclusive growth means that we need to think about how we invest in people, how we invest in talent, whether the way we've thought about that in the past is still the right way forward, the way we think about the allocation of fiscal resources is still appropriate. For example, the way we think about entrepreneurship is the right way around. And I think actually in many of the countries on the continent, we have some pretty good models. It's not fortuitous that Africa is growing faster than many other parts of the globe. It's the second fastest growing region of the world, and you know, 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world for the next 5 years, 10 years, are in Africa. So all of that is part of the reason we need to think about things differently. But there are also some things that are just important to keep in mind and to remember and not to let go of. And some of those things are the things that I think Europe is struggling with at the moment, or some important countries in Europe are struggling with at the moment. And they're not going to go away. You know, they're tough, and they're things that are difficult sometimes for us to recognize, and they're boring, but they're important. Macroeconomic stability is hard to achieve and easy to lose. And one of the reasons why many countries in Africa are growing fast now is because we've gone through a very painful period of getting to macroeconomic stability. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for inclusive and job-creating growth. But I can tell you that unless you have it, you can't get growth. And you can't get any kind of, if you don't have any kind of growth, you can't create jobs. So you need to get that. You need to get the investment in education, but just spending money on education alone doesn't get you good quality education. Having resources doesn't get you growth and jobs. Having those resources, using the proceeds of those resources in a good way, gets you some of the jobs that we're looking at. So there are different components to the way we think about growth. Innovation is the other thing. And listening to people, understanding where the youth is an important component of some of the growth models we need to think about.
Thank you very much. You were talking about the natural resources a little bit for a second there. And I guess one of the key elements, though, also looking at growth on the continent has to be the human resource and the capital that we need in order to drive some of the growth that we're seeing. But you'll also concede, Maria, that the growth needs to be more significant. We need higher rates in order to get us to where we need to do. And I guess the role of skills, unskilled, the human capital in terms of the growth we're trying to achieve?
Yes. Thank you very much, Tommy, and giving me a chance also to be part of it. In Africa, this time we have 1 billion people with a projection of 2.3 billion in 2050. If we use this resource properly, it's a great asset. If not, it's a potential risk. And every year, next to Asia, Africa is the second largest continent, holding 15% of the world's population. So you can see this huge resource where, in another case, we are having a big youth bulge, where every year we are having 10 to 12 million youth coming, seeking for a job. So for me, investing in such a human capital is a big asset for Africa to reach to a level of a best economic model.
I'd like to come back a little bit later in the conversation as to exactly how one goes about doing so. One can say that that is an ideal, that's what we want to achieve, but oftentimes the implementation and the process of making that happen is the challenge. So we'll come back to that in a bit. I don't know if I can come to you. When we are having this discourse about natural resources and how we use those things to achieve the kind of growth that we aim for, I think sometimes we may run the risk of losing the focus on where the priority areas need to be. We're so focused on the growth, we often forget some of the social elements as well. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of how does one try to marry those two things moving forward?
The natural resources is definitely significant in Africa. But it's very interesting that in the past 5 years, there are about 12 countries that grew more than 7% a year, every year in Africa. And of that, 7 of them are natural resource producers, and the other 6 of them have no natural resources, or very little, significantly little natural resources, and are not selling to China. And the important thing to note there that it's not just natural resources that's fueling Africa's growth, but the countries that are able to look at the key resources, their human resources, promote more education, and we've done significantly better in that area. For instance, high school, people going into high school have gone from about 30% of the population in the 60s to, in places like Mauritius today, about 88–90% of the population getting through high school. And this is seriously opening up the services sector. And the services sector has become a significant growth model or factor in Africa's growth. So how we're using technology, the financial services, the telecommunications industry, infrastructure development, which is one of the key things holding back Africa's growth. In fact, one study believes that if we do the infrastructure investments in energy, in roads, in transportation, it will add a minimum of 2% growth to the GDP of many, many African countries. So really the marriage and the focus on the services sector is, I think, also very critical.
Okay, I'm going to love and leave you. And those who are wagering on whether I'm going to fall down these stairs, you're about to lose, because I'm not falling. Abna, if I can just ask you a question. You talk a little bit about the need to focus on services sectors, but the assumption generally is that one is looking at a specific role for women. One of the questions, in fact, that came up was, what is the unique role for women? Is it a unique role, or is it simply for us to recognize that it is a role that needs to be incorporated?
Women, at least in Ghana, women comprise 51% of the population. And that the services of 51% of potentially your labor force cannot be considered as, as something we cannot afford at all. So for me, it's not as much as a unique thing as it's the natural order of things. And the opportunities, therefore, have to start from the basics. Getting them properly trained. There's a lot of Africans also in the diaspora, and we see a hungering for people to come back to the continent. And many people are coming back to the continent with skills they've learned in Europe and America and implementing businesses. And this sector, just because we have such a young, vibrant population, is also fueling a lot of innovation and growth in the services sector. But I think one of the things we're doing not so well in Africa that we need to work on is on food security. We're growing agriculture mainly in the cash crops for export to Europe and to Asia and to America, but we have vast land resources, vast water resources, etc. And we're not looking at the food security needs of our people. We import way too much grain, food, poultry, etc. today when we can actually use this. So women, men, we all have to, I'd like not to take this as a special case of people. This is the natural course that the African continent needs to follow.
Okay, there's a question here, and I am going to pick on someone. The question is, how can African women develop faster than their European, American, and Asian counterparts? Who asked that question? All right, if I can have a microphone down here in the front. Is there one nearby? Fantastic. Can you elaborate a little bit on the question of can African women develop faster? What do you mean? Because it implies in the question that we haven't developed, and I have a bit of a problem with that. So perhaps you can unpack it for me.
My comment was actually with regard to the previous presentation, where we see that women in Europe, the US, and Asia face lots of challenges to develop and to grow through to the top. So my question was, as we have a continent with Africa with lots of potential for development, how can we make sure that you anticipate the barriers and, to your point, beyond the fact that you need women to fuel the growth, how do you anticipate and make sure that there's lots of African women like you sitting in boards, sitting in executive committee, sitting in governments?
Thank you very much. Maria, you're regarded very often as a trailblazer, particularly in the space that you're in, whether you like it or not, so just nod and agree with me. You're regarded as a trailblazer, but very often the question around the pipeline and getting women to positions where they're executive level, board level, is a question, and often people say, well, we don't have enough talent to bring women up through the ranks, and that's kind of why the status quo sort of is as it is, and it sort of trails into a nothing argument. I'd like to hear your thoughts, and coupling with her comments, on how do we actually look at women in Africa and learn from lessons we've seen elsewhere to change the dynamics a bit.
It's a really important question, and it's a really challenging question. I think there's a whole bunch of different things. I mean, just coming from South Africa, we know that there's legislation. That's one way of thinking about it. I have to say that although there's employment equity legislation that deals with both race and gender, and that goes some way to dealing with the challenge, that in itself doesn't change everything, because what needs to change is the way we think about things, the way we challenge each other, and the way we make sure that the pipeline doesn't stop somewhere, as we saw in that presentation. I came in right at the end of it. But we all know what the numbers are, and we all know what the challenge is. And it's often just the culture and the mindsets in organizations. And I sit at the top of one, and I can tell you it's very present now in the discussions we have right at the top of the organization. It's the only way to challenge it. So we have to challenge it at the top. We have to set the tone differently at the top of organizations. But it's also in the way we think about it right in society, right from the way we educate girls and the opportunities we create for girls. And I see that, we run businesses across 12 African countries, and I see a sea change in the way people think about things, in the way people are challenging each other and themselves and in communities. And it's about making sure that those challenges exist. It's also the way in which we role model. So if we have the right role models, I think that goes a long way. And, we talk a lot, and it's, as an African woman, it's one of the fantastic things that has changed in the last 10 years about Africa is just confidence. It's the confidence that we have in ourselves that we can succeed. That the conversations about Africa are no longer just about aid, AIDS, and corruption. They are about entrepreneurs that are succeeding, about the potential that Africa has, about the potential that African women have. And that changes the conversation. And that changes the conversation for women. And if women can begin to have those conversations about themselves, we start to change the dynamic. You know, we were talking earlier about education. The numbers have changed dramatically. And if we continue to change the numbers, you know, by 2020, we expect to see, you know, 50% of young Africans with tertiary education. 20 years ago, as you rightly pointed out, it was 30% of the population had tertiary education. That changes the dynamic. If you think that 50% of the population in Africa is women, girls, that changes the conversation.
Thank you very much, Maria. If one is trying to then identify solutions, we recognize that there are some stuff we need to gosh, my English went out the door, sorry. There are some things that we need to change, and there are some things that we need to keep. One of the key questions around education, and I'd like to refer to a question from the floor, promoting entrepreneurship, particularly for women-run initiatives from within corporate organizations, will be a big driver for growth. So in identifying some of the models that we believe can change, and I guess, how do we begin to change those dynamics without sort of bringing the whole system to a complete halt and trying to build it from scratch, particularly when developing entrepreneurship skills in line with education and confidence building for women?
Yeah, I think the whole issue is education, and we need to invest mainly on young girls. And in most of our countries, training curriculums do not incorporate trainings in developing entrepreneurship. So it matters what kind of skilled human capital we are producing in each of our universities countries. That's why we always produce 10 to 12 million young girls, young youth in our continent. So the issue is incorporating trainings, training curriculum, having entrepreneurship in trainings, and also encouraging, providing opportunities for youth, particularly for girls. As it's already said, it's more than 50% of the population that are women. So I believe mainly on education and the whole purpose of working in developing our successors. The issue of role model had been there. We need to inspire others so that our daughters, the young ones, are going to take over from us.
Okay, I'd like to unpack the education question for a minute. I'm going to ask you just to hang on for me, Abner, for a second, because I am coming to you next. But I just want to make a point speaking on education. It always sounds good when we say we need to educate people. But I can only speak, let's say, from South Africa, where I live, where 38% is a pass to finish high school. Now, if you have people who are passing at lower rates such as that, how do you begin to change the dynamics when, in fact, the skill level that you're being given into tertiary level isn't high enough? And Abner, perhaps you can speak to that and make your point in addition. Maria, I'll come back to you after that.
In terms of the entrepreneurship, if you want to see women in entrepreneurship really come to West Africa, the West African women have held the economies of these countries and grown the economies of these countries for several years. We have what we call the informal sector, made up of many market women, many farmers, and these are the people growing our cash crops, producing cocoa, making Ghana the second largest producer of cocoa in Ghana, holding up the Ivory Coast market for cocoa, etc., and selling these products that bring in billions of dollars. I think what the next transformation for a lot of these people, because whether on the continent or outside, when we're talking about business leaders, we're not defining this group of people. We're not even measuring their contribution and finding out what their economic status and their social contributions are. And per the initial analysis that some institutions have done, they are actually the significant majority of some of these economies. So for us, the next level to take them to is how we organize them, how we take them from running in what often is the case, multi-million-dollar businesses, but they are sitting in the markets, they are very sophisticated, but they don't have the institutions and the systems in place that helps us to measure an APSA, for instance, or these other type of companies. So that is the next growth level for us. Education, I think by and by, the quality is getting much, much better. I don't think that is our biggest problem. I think the inroads and the investments have largely been made. There's a lot of privatization, at least in West Africa, of the educational institutions. And so there's access to educational institutions for people. Maybe not everyone has the financing for some of those, but those are being resolved. So whilst education is changing a lot of people, I really still do not think that that is our biggest shortfall today.
So our biggest shortfall will be, what, not developing entrepreneurs and giving them that support and the linkages?
I think it's taking them to the next level, getting them organized, getting them into the formal tax brackets, measuring their contributions, looking at how we can bring new ideas and, innovations to them. There are many of them that just sit on cash, or their next investment is another real estate or start a new business, etc. And this, understudied and underappreciated part of the economy, I think, is critical going forward.
Thanks, Abner. Maria.
See, to me, I think it's important just to keep in mind that there are big differences here. You mentioned South Africa on education, and so it's easy to get lost in the averages. I mean, on average on the continent, countries spend 20% of their budgets on education. That's high by OECD standards. If you measure it as a percentage of GDP, we're spending around 5% of GDP on education. OECD, about 6%. If you it's more, we spend in Africa more as a percentage of GDP on education than Latin America or than many countries in Asia. In South Africa, the quality of spend and the quality of outcomes is not great. In a country like Kenya, the quality is great. Kenya, if you look at the World Economic Forum's competitiveness report, Kenya ranks right up there, I think, in the top 50. So it's important to understand that there are big differentials here. I think the other thing we must differentiate is, I think education is a really big term. So there's education and there are skills. And I think those, you need to invest in education. We need to invest in skills because that's where entrepreneurship comes in. But there are other things that are important in that too. We talk about entrepreneurship and skills. Lots of other exciting things are happening. Earlier on we were talking about investment in infrastructure. One of the big revolutions in our part of the world has actually been in technology and in mobile. It's the fastest growing region for mobile technology. 700 million mobile subscribers on the continent. Fastest part of the world for mobile technology. We've got broadband connection and speed building up in that part of the world at a phenomenal rate. All of that creates the ability to do things very differently, including banking and creating access to financial services in a way that's not been possible in the past. So those are the big game changers. When we talk about new models for growth, we have to think differently about that. And I think that those are the things that change: skills, innovation, the way we think about education, the way we think about inclusivity.
There's a question up on the screen. Is the confidence to have your own style key? Who asked that question? You can own up. Is there anybody? Oh, here she is. Can I have a microphone over here to this lady? I just want you to talk. Obviously, you're not talking about how one dresses and so on, clearly. But perhaps you can say or explain to us exactly what you mean about the confidence to have your style. And that'll tie into my next question to the panel as well. So please go ahead.
Two things prompted me to ask the question. The first one was in the McKinsey's session before this, seeing the stat that 70-something% of successful CEOs have changed companies. So they've had different experiences, which I think brings confidence. And secondly, Maria, for example, having such a varied career, I think brings confidence that you can be a woman, you can be different, you can bring different experiences to a board. I think that's critical.
Now, I guess and perhaps Maria, actually all three of you can speak to this. If one is talking about helping women develop their own style, regardless of whether one is on a board or trying to start their own business or whatever it is that they may be doing, how do we begin to foster an environment like that, which leads us, of course, eventually to the growth that we're trying to attain? And I guess if I can ask you to address that first, please. Lagest, and then Maria and Abena.
I think the issue of mentorship can play a great role in this. We're quite confident women can help mentoring the other ones coming up. But with all the cultural barriers and constraints we have in Africa, developing one's confidence is not an easy thing, and that starts from home. The way our daughters had been socialized, the way ourselves we had been socialized, reaching to a level of developing that confidence. So I believe mentoring plays a great role in such a situation, so that we really develop our successors following us.
Maria?
It's an interesting thing. I mean, I think the answer has to be that, you know, you learn from different experiences, and you understand that life is about dealing with complexity and with challenge. And so I personally have done very different things in my life. So I started life in banking and came back to banking after being the public service and doing different things in the public service. So being the treasury for almost 8 years, and then running a railway and port company for almost 6 years, which was challenging and interesting. And what I learned from all of those experiences is that, you know, that they're all fraught with challenge, that you have to listen, you have to take some really tough decisions, and you're going to get a lot of things wrong as you take those decisions. And you're going to have to learn from it, and you're going to have to take people with you, and you're going to have to learn from to have really good teams around you, and you're going to have to be open to change. And the most exciting thing about the environment you're operating in is that they are fraught they're fraught with complexity, but they're also filled with opportunity, with change, and with challenge. And that if you can instill that in organizations, that you've got the recipe for success. And if you can build organizations, if you can populate organizations with talent from a variety of places, that's what it's all about. And whether that was in the public service, where people make the assumption right up front that you can't change. You can change. You can change anything you put your mind to. And you just have to create that confidence that you can. And if you put that into your head and you put that into the heads of people around you, it happens. And I think that that's the exciting part of things, and that's the exciting part of the change in our part of the world. People have begun to believe that the change is happening, and we're going to make it, and it's going to be different. And that wasn't there 10 years ago.
Question from the audience, and I quite like this one. Lots of emphasis on the education of girls, but what about educating boys on empowering girls to fulfill their potential as leaders and thereby empowering boys as well? Who asked that question? Okay, people don't like me picking on them, do they? Okay. I actually just wanted to get a little bit more context into that question. But if we can unpack it a little bit, Abner, clearly, as you said, the natural order of things is that there are men and there are women, and we live on the same planet and we share the same space and resources. However, the question of empowering boys in order to ensure that girls are also empowered isn't one that comes up very often, and two, I don't know that there are many models that explore that. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how one actually begins to change the dialogue between the two, so that it's not, oh, you're a girl, so I need to help you because shame you can't do it for yourself. But equally, not having girls saying, well, I can't ask you because you're a boy. How do we begin to change the dynamics so that we have a healthier discussion and hopefully can work easily together moving forward?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure it's about educating boys on empowering girls. I think it's about empowering girls and giving them the information and the confidence to make their own decisions. But having said that, I remember very well when I first went into my university class, the business school, and I'd gone my preparatory school, my secondary school education had all been in a only girls school, and I'd been quite insulated from the male population, only to go to a mixed university. And a professor shows up at our first accounting class and says, oh, this is such a difficult topic for girls.
Oh,
you know, and this is in a university, in the business school, and so you'll need a lot of help from the boys, and you should form study groups, because there were only 20 women and 100 boys in the first year class. And it was the first time ever I was hearing that I couldn't do something because I was a girl. All the other schools I'd been to told me I could do anything I wanted to do. So for me, that was so many years ago. But that had been the attitude at that time. But quickly they changed their mind, of course, after the first exams came and 5 girls topped all the accounting classes and formed a study group without any guy in it. So, I mean, take the experience in Europe and America as we've been reading, or as was presented. It's not that the men don't know, even in the places where men are educated to empower women. So the issue, I think, it's not that. It's about giving people the opportunities, you know, and putting them in the environment, whether it's through mentorship, etc. And that's where, for me, the access to information, the access to education is so critical. We're talking about, Marie talked about mobile phones. A critical example today in Ghana and in other sub-Saharan African countries is the access to cell phones for farmers. There are people that have farms far in the interior, and now they have a cell phone, and then the middlemen traders show up at on these farms and say, okay, I want to buy your basket of tomatoes at this price. That farmer now quickly sends an SMS to a certain number and asks, what's the selling price of tomatoes in the markets today? And often they find out that that price in the market is 300 times what the middleman is offering them. So they have the information and the confidence to negotiate something else. You know, so for me, that tool, those new tools for development and financial intermediation is critical in our development further.
Jimmy, can I say one?
Yeah.
Can I add to that? Because, you know, that farmer in Kenya can, if they decide, if they do the transaction there and then, can get paid immediately through M-Pesa or through, if they bank with Barclays, they can get paid too immediately. And that's the transformative power of technology and innovation. The change that makes is phenomenal, right? So you do, that's what change is about. That's what economic progress is about. That's the changing models that we're talking about. The power shifts from that middle person. And you reduce, the other thing is that you're reducing fundamentally the cost of doing business. 100 years ago, it would be the same as taking 15 days out of the transportation costs of goods from a port to inland. That's the equivalent of this. It's phenomenal. It changes the way the world works for many people.
As we draw towards the latter part of this session, I'd like to do a little bit of a rapid-fire request. And I'm not going to ask you necessarily to ask more questions from the audience, and I'm coming back to the panel in just a second. But what I'd like to do is hear some suggestions and specific thoughts on exactly what it is that we need to do to change what's happening on the continent. So, for example, if one says education, what does that mean? Do we mean the way we educate? Do we mean the tools that we use to educate? Do we mean access to education? Do we mean access to sanitation, healthcare? So I'd like to hear a little bit of some input from the audience as well. And if I can go to each of the panelists as well. If we say we want to use this as an opportunity to identify specific things that we should do to bring about better growth on the continent, build on already what we have, what would those things be? I'm not going to come to you because you're nodding a lot, so I know that you've got a lot to say on that one. Nikesh, if I can begin with you, I'd like to hear maybe 2 or 3 very specific things that are practical, that are implementable, that one can do to begin making an input towards development and changing some of the growth challenges we have on the continent.
I saw one of the questions in connecting the multinationals in subcontracting to SMEs, which is an area of focus. I just want to intervene. We have a global platform of connecting the women vendors to those multinational companies, and this had been a lead role taken by the UN International Trade Center Geneva, working with WeConnect Ethiopia, with WeConnect. So that's an area where, because most of our informal sector operators, like in my country's case, 70% of them are women, and they're always in a subsistence business which we have never changed their lives. So we need to transform those businesses so that they aspire to be involved in us.
So what does that mean? Sorry, before you go on, we need to transform those businesses. What is the tool to transform those businesses?
Yes, I'm coming to that. In many of our African countries, we don't have institutions that really provide packaged services for women to graduate from the informal sector to the formal. It starts from providing viable business ideas, skills, which had been mentioned, and finance. Those small tools, there should be packaged services which can be available to women so that they easily graduate from being informal to formal, and they produce better products, exportable products, create employment opportunities, and generate foreign currency, which our continent needs most.
Okay, obviously I just want to make this point. Someone sent in a thought. Access to technology via mobile phones is fundamental for development. Absolutely. So that's one way. Continue to building on the technology that allows some of the innovative transactions to happen. Maria, if you had to identify, and I'm going to come back for your second one, I guess, just now, one thing of 3, what would it be that we need to specifically do or look at that'll allow us to move forward?
Sure. One of 3, that's really hard. I think it's investment in infrastructure. So I'm assuming all the other things are being done. I'm an economist by training, so I make lots of assumptions. But I think the investment in infrastructure has to be the big game changer, because although we've upped our investment in infrastructure on the continent, I think we're now spending at around $80 billion a year on infrastructure in roads, rails, ports, and power. We need to be spending around $120 billion a year. So we're still short of what we need to be spending in order to have the kind of growth that's going to be sustainable and job creating. And we're not going to be able to connect, to get all of the connections in place, to connect large and small businesses. Our bank, for example, has created a portal now to connect small and medium-sized businesses to the large MNCs who've got the big projects. But you need the ongoing investment in that infrastructure. Not only does it attract the FDI in, but I think you need the internal investment and you need the intra-Africa investment in place as well. So I think getting that infrastructure investment going at a much higher level than we have at the moment is going to be critical for ongoing growth.
Development in technology, packages, infrastructure development. Abner?
I absolutely agree with you. Infrastructure for me is the very, very top of the list. Today, Nigeria produces about 2,500 megawatts of power, when its actual need is about almost 20,000 megawatts of power. This is a country, if you do a night survey of Africa, the African continent, the only light you see is the flaring of gas in Nigeria. It's flaring everything, and yet businesses, banks, multi-story buildings live on generators, and they have backups to the generators and a backup to the backup generator. And the development of infrastructure is so transformative. And the IPPs, that is where Africa is going, because the governments, of course, do not have all the money to do infrastructure. And many of the markets are moving towards market prices for infrastructure, because it's definitely cheaper to have a gas-fueled power plant than to put diesel in the generator and the backup generator. So that is so critical, I think, to taking us to the next step, and just putting a road between linking up our agricultural centers, putting in place the port infrastructure. It's so transformative. And I hear from some of the sessions yesterday that Europe and North America are wringing their hands in terms of where's the next growth opportunities for them, because their markets are not growing as much as they could. And I say, come to Africa. India is, China is, Brazil, South American countries are partnering, not colonizing, partnering in the development of some of these businesses in infrastructure in other areas. And I think Europe, that has a lot of experience in working in Africa in previous years, must start looking again at some of these opportunities.
One question, and I didn't come to it earlier, but it's just cropped up again on the screen, and I'd like to see who asked the question. Infrastructure is critical and also notorious for waste and corruption everywhere in the world. How to do it right? Who asked that question? The lady over there, if you can have if you can just elaborate a little bit. Obviously, you're not just asking the question because you want the answer. You obviously have some thoughts around how one begins to unpack that. We'd like to hear a little bit on that. No, I don't think you have the answer. I just think that it's something that you're asking and wondering and trying to identify.
Exactly. I was struggling with the infrastructure, because everybody mentioned it in their own way on the panel, and I think it's absolutely critical for progress. And yet, every time I open the newspaper, I live in Holland, there's another story about how money has been misspent, how corruption, bribery, every challenge you can imagine that comes into these projects. It's such large amounts of money, such complex projects, so few people that understand how to run them well. I wonder, when it comes down to how do you make it work in a efficient, effective way?
Thank you very much. Abner, and perhaps all of you again can touch on this. This is always a challenge when one is looking at the kinds of money that are going to be spent in order to develop the infrastructure that we're talking about. How do you deal with the corruption question? And how do we begin to identify ways in which we can minimize that, if not eradicate?
I think it's the transparency in the tender processes are very, very key. And some countries have made some progress in that. I think the institutionalization of democracy and people demanding accountability of public servants, of politicians is very, very key in the award of infrastructure and in the minimizing of corruption in these. I think gradually getting more private sector people involved in the development of infrastructure is key. So we're seeing more public-private partnerships in the development of key infrastructure, and also the demand really for accountability and explanations how the money was spent. Parliament and the electorate being up to date on these are critical.
Absolutely, and I think the accountability on all sides, accountability on the on government side when the project is being required by a government or a government type institution, the accountability on the providers of finance, whether those are multinational companies, NGO types, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank. So the system has to work on all sides of this equation, and that accountability, that transparency. And then I think in country, when there is corruption, that action needs to be taken, and it needs to be visible, and it needs to be clear that corruption is unacceptable. And if you misbehave, you're going to suffer the consequences of that, and it's not on. And that corruption erodes democracy, and it erodes progress. And I think that's the only way to do it. Not doing something because you're scared of corruption is just not acceptable either. So it's just making sure that the system works properly.
Abner, sorry, not Abner. And I guess one of the, your one point that you began was the need for these packages. What would your second tool or vehicle be to contribute to this driving of growth?
I think in the issue of Africa, we really need trade integration. We need to start trading among ourselves. The issue of infrastructure being built within Africa being major. African countries will look to the US market, we look to Europe. There's nothing wrong on that. But again, in Africa, we're trading 10-12% among ourselves, where we have a huge potential. One country can be a supplier and the other can be a consumer. So that's where we are lagging behind. There is a need to trade among ourselves. Infrastructure should be set in place, and states should play a major role where the private sector should be given a lead role, leading the economy. But huge investment like infrastructure in the other areas should be done by the state, and the focus should be made on private and public partnership.
Your second one, Maria? Do you have a second one? Well, you've got a lot, so you have to pick one.
No, I think it's also part of, it's a different kind of infrastructure, but it's a continued investment in innovation, and then in financial development, so financial market development, because I think we've made great progress in that. But I think it's also, we can't shy away from the fact that outside of South Africa, which has got a very deep, very well-developed financial market, the rest of the countries around the African continent still have some way to go to develop really deep, good, liquid financial markets. And I say that, and and also recognize that particularly in the last 5 years, we've seen great strides in that. So technology has helped with that, and we made the point earlier on that cell phone banking has helped us get much further down the line with financial inclusivity. And then, we've also seen countries being able to access global financial markets more rapidly in the last 5 years than any other period before. I mean, Zambia was just did its debut bond the other day, the 10-year bond in the US markets, which was 16 times oversubscribed and priced significantly better than a couple of European countries who are members of the EU, and they will remain unnamed. But and if somebody had said that 10 years ago, we would have all said never. But it's happened, and so, you know, although we do need to deepen financial markets on the continent, and for us to get that infrastructure going is going to be really important for development as well.
I think I'd love to see more investments in healthcare, because there's no use having a big population, but they are not healthy, and they are not living long enough to fulfill their potential and take the economies to the next level. So for me, bigger investments in healthcare, in those social services, are critical to our next level of growth.
If we're saying we need bigger investment in healthcare and social services, it naturally brings itself to the question of gender equity and access to those services for young girls especially. One of the big questions that often comes up is, it's one thing to say to a young girl, you can be whatever you want, you can do whatever you wish, you're amazing, you're incredible. But how do you do that in an environment where she can't go to school because she has her monthly cycle and she doesn't have access to sanitary products? How do you say that to her when the school environment she's supposed to be educated in isn't physically safe for her? Where are we making inroads around that dialogue? Not to say, is it on the table? Because we all know it's on the table. We all know what the numbers look like. But are we making inroads in having a fundamental shift around looking at the provision of services that allow for the kind of healthy people that you want? Not just physically healthy, but mentally and emotionally healthy. Yes, I'd like you to answer that one, because you brought it up.
No, you know, the healthcare situation, first I think it's the onus is on our governments. They collect our taxes, they manage the funds from our resources, the sale of our resources, etc. But, you know, there's also a lot with the international drug companies and the policies around making drugs affordable in Africa. There's also a lot around preventative issues around a lot of our healthcare issues, because sanitation, you know, a lot of the healthcare, malaria, tuberculosis, diarrhea, etc., that are major problems in Africa still today, but are not elsewhere, have a lot to do with sanitation and information around that and the management of our sanitary situation. So there are definitely private investments that can be made, or policies that can be made in terms of making drugs available and more affordable. India has a few models around which Africa can working with the negotiating with the drug producing companies to develop some generic forms that are sold at much cheaper prices. So definitely I think there's a whole lot more work and discussion that needs to go around in that area.
Yeah, and I guess.
Yeah, I just want to cite an example. One of our Cartier finalists for the Sub-Saharan Africa was started producing menstrual pads. And she was sharing us, we were wondering, the Rwandese government has allocated funding for the purchase of menstrual pads so that girls who cannot afford buying can get those, because many days they are not in school in those days, and many of the women that are working cannot go because of this. So I think such kinds of facilities should be provided for girls. This is just an example in menstrual pads.
Provision of all of this by government necessarily? I mean,
Not
it seems...
Not necessarily, but I think, like, if you take the case of Rwanda, the government has taken a lead role. There are areas where each stakeholder has to play a major role, but I see major role also in governments, mainly in health, because the investment is high.
You mentioned public-private partnerships a little bit earlier, and we hear this all the time, that there is a greater need for this. However, oftentimes when one looks closer on the ground, there is still an expectation that governments are going to provide A, B, C, D, E, F. How do we begin to provide spaces, Marie, and I'm coming to you because you've sat in both environments, where we have those partnerships being more effective closer to the ground? Or is it just a question that we don't know it's happening and therefore assume it's not happening?
Well, I think we do have quite a lot of it happening, and you can see as well, you know, we spoke earlier about infrastructure, you know, how much infrastructure investment is going on. What's also happening is that more of that infrastructure investment now is being funded and financed by the private sector. You know, the other interesting thing about what's happening in Africa is just the way the patterns of trade have shifted. And, you know, we were talking about Europe earlier, but there's been a big shift of trade out of Europe and into Asia, particularly trade with sub-Saharan Africa. You know, 20 years ago, the trade between Africa and Europe was significantly higher than it is now. And I think Europe's share of exports to Africa was something like 51%. It's now 28%. And that's a very big shift. It's moved to China. And a lot of the Chinese, you know, trade models with Africa are different and involve a lot more investments in infrastructure. There's the financing of the infrastructure is often done on a private-public partnership kind of model. A lot of what the challenges with the private-public partnership models have emerged when the rules of the game are not very clear, when the legislative environments aren't clear, when legislation changes. And so if you talk to business people, if you talk to people in the private sector, the one requirement we all have of governments is that you need to have the rules of the game pretty clear up front. And they need to stay in place for long periods of time. When the rules change, it's impossible to have sustainable public-private partnerships. And I think it's not been like that. It's certainly not been like that in every country, in every project, in every sector. And that makes those projects very expensive and very erratic.
You were nodding, Ebna, when she was saying that. I'd like you to elaborate on what you were nodding about.
Yeah, no, rules, keeping rules, and it's about being able to plan ahead. Knowing certainty and information is so critical for the business environment. No investor wants to take their money where there isn't, they are not guaranteed an open playing field. The rules are changing very quickly, etc., to suit some individuals' interests. So I think that is critical, whether it's international investors or it's local business people.
And really, really quickly, because we are pretty much out of time, your last thing that you would support in terms of needing us to change or add or adapt or keep for that growth, the last thing, the third thing.
Well, I think today there's a lot of investment opportunities in Africa. I think one of Africa's biggest challenges it's the capital to move these investment opportunities forward. And so what we need today are more partnerships, whether it's from Europe, it's from South America, it's from Asia, to develop some of these opportunities. So we're open. It's the fastest growing billion people continent. It's the exciting place. So please come join us and move this continent forward. Thank you very much.
And don't forget to call her on your way. Nagest, you?
I think Pan-African institutions like the African Union, I believe they have a major role to play working on our trade and financial integration. That's how we can go forward. I think they have a major role there. They really can play, taking the continent to the next level.
I can't believe you brought in the African Union when we have 2 minutes to go on this discussion. I cannot believe you just did that to me. And I guess we'll have to bring you back to have a whole session on the African Union, but thank you. Maria?
You know, Africa's biggest resource isn't its commodities, it's its people. And we will have over 300 million people in the middle class, broadly defined, which is, a significant number of people. We're a continent, so we're not a country, so it's hard to compare it with India or China, but it's a significant number of people. And I think we continue to invest in people, and I think that that's what we need to continue to do. That's what's going to give Africa its competitive advantage. I know that there are risks associated with that, because unless we get that investment right, unless we get the model right, that we are able to ensure that there are opportunities for young people in terms of jobs. And we started this conversation with the real challenge of our time, which is jobs for young people, and that's not an African challenge, it's a global challenge. But I am confident that as the global economy, we will together find solutions for that. It's going to take time, and we will find solutions for that on our continent. And so it's that investment in people that we will have to get right and will continue to think about and work on. And that's the opportunity in Africa. It's the combination of resources and people that will make us great.
Ladies, to each of you, thank you very much for your time. And to you, thank you very much for your attention and for your participation. We really do appreciate it. And of course, please stay right where you are. The next plenary follows immediately with Cherie Blair and Wonka Roy. I'm Dumi Makhabu. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.